thanks a lot for coming along. Hopefully this will be an interesting webinar with some information that helps with getting started with authoring and consuming IFC. I'm Jon Mirtschin, so I'm a director now on the buildingSMART board of Australasia. I've been involved with buildingSMART International for about 6 or 7 years. And I'm also the founder of Geometry GMO Specialist Consultancy and Software Development, particularly helping with interoperability tools. You'll notice that this webinar is brought to you by the Digital Infrastructure Network, which is a group that you can join on LinkedIn and has regular meetings throughout various cities in Australia. I was lucky to attend the event in Perth last week. And we'll make special note of an event that's coming up in October, the Future Infrastructure Summit, which was held last year in Brisbane. This year it's being held in 2 cities, Melbourne and Brisbane, and you can check the dates to save down at the bottom of the slide. And if you'd like to nominate a speaker to the event, then there's a call for speakers which is open, as you can see on that webinar, that you can lodge your interest in speaking to. Just before I make a start, then I'd like to first of all thank the supporters, Austroads, who are a major partner with buildingSMART Australasia, and our gold sponsors, CIMIC and Autodesk. And you'll see also listed below our silver supporters and our corporate supporters. And of course, if anyone else is not already a supporter and member of buildingSMART Australasia and would like to join, then please get in contact and we'll give you more information on how to do that. To give you some information about buildingSMART Australasia, it's a chapter of buildingSMART International. buildingSMART International was founded over 20 years ago, initially as a global alliance about how a common or standard data model could be used for representing the built environment. And then the international group operates through a series of chapters in various regions around the world. So buildingSMART Australasia engages locally with government and software groups and users and clients and contractors and everyone else involved in the built environment about what openBIM and interoperability can be facilitated using particularly the standards that buildingSMART manages, the industry foundation classes, BIM collaboration format, and the buildingSMART data dictionary. And today we're going to be focusing on the IFC, or industry foundation classes. And this webinar, it's only a brief webinar, so we can only touch on things in a very in a small manner. But how do we actually begin authoring IFC and consuming IFC, in particular authoring applications that are popular in the Australian region? So first of all, to quickly go back on some basics. So what is IFC, or what are the industry foundation classes? And the industry foundation classes is the data model that's used to, identify concepts and relationships that exist to construct, manage, and maintain our built environment. So most of you would have used applications that save to, or everyone would have used applications that save to a file format, such as Microsoft Office to doc or Excel files, etc. And often, most of you would have started with a CAD environment, which might save to a file format like DWG, which has entities within it like lines, arcs, and circles. Now, if you're doing BIM, on authoring BIM models, then you would actually author and save files to formats like .rvt for Revit, and they have like a database format for concepts like walls, doors, windows, etc. IFC is a similar concept to that, where it has lots of concepts around the built environment. So it also has concepts and relationships for walls and various other things through all stages of a built environment project. So from concept to design through to construction, handover, operations and maintenance, and even through to demolition. The difference being that you can't really open an RVT file without using an application such as Revit. That's a closed file format that isn't openly published. IFC is a file format that is openly published and often written to a text file. So I think if you're actually looking for a better explanation about how IFC enables us to communicate, I often do share this video. I won't do that in this particular webinar, but search for the end of Babel on YouTube. It was nicely preserved by Stephen Hamill of NBS. And if you have 10 or 15 minutes, that gives a much better explanation about the purpose of IFC and how it allows different participants and stakeholders in a project to communicate. So IFC is a data model that's been developed over the past 20 years. And most people would consider it to be simply a file, but hopefully, well, there's also, moving beyond that. It really is just a mechanism for exchanging concepts in an agreed manner. So if you've ever opened a .ifc file in a notepad or text editor, you would see the file contents look something like this image on the left, where there's a whole bunch of text lines that have a concept which is identified with a class name, and then attributes or relationships are expressed after that. So anything sort of more complex than a simple number or text is written as a line reference, association as a relationship between one concept and another. Remember, this was born out of a technology about 20 years ago in the era of floppy disks, and STEP was certainly probably a cutting-edge technology about how to read and write data to text file at that particular point in time. There's another official format for exchanging IFC, and that's an IFC XML format. XML is a slightly more modern way of reading and writing text files. It's a little bit easier to read as a human for two reasons. One, every attribute gets identified with a string, so instead of just knowing the sequence and the order of these attributes on the left-hand side, you can actually identify what a characteristic is that's being expressed. And it's also has a hierarchy to it where you can embed information. So it's not chasing concepts and relationships up and down a file. Again, just remember that the purpose of IFC is more for machine-readable exchange rather than human. So a computer really shouldn't need, the data models are exactly the same for the writing of these files, and the contents can be identical. It's just the way that it formats and recognizes that data when it reads or writes a text file. IFC files can be notoriously big, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons for that. There's also another agreed convention around sending or sharing an IFC file, and that's IFC zip. And if your particular software doesn't support IFC zip, then it's actually really just a zip file as if you'd encoded it in any other technique, including Windows File Explorer. And you can change the file extension to a .zip file and extract that file, and you'll find inside it an IFC or an IFC XML file. So because it is a text-based file storage and there's a lot of repetition, they do compress extremely well. So if you're looking at uploading a file that's sort of hundreds of megabytes or something like that, then you can save on that some of that pain by zipping it and even just naming it .ifc zip, and many software will recognize that out of the box. You're not restricted to these two particular file formats. You can also express the file in formats such as JSON, and there's been some exploratory work done around that. There's also linked data and expressing IFC data model in other ways of exchanging and communicating it, which are under exploration and development. I'm going to touch on just a couple of other concepts which are important about understanding when you need to either receive or generate an IFC file. Model view definitions are an important part of sharing IFC, and a model view definition is really a subset of IFC that relates to a particular use case. So if you think that an IFC data model is capable of say, 1,000 concepts, then for any one use case, you won't, there's a different requirement in the information you need to share if you're transferring a model for a coordination use case in contrast to a structural analysis use case or a thermal analysis use case. There are many other, or there are more model view definitions such as operations and maintenance, and some new model view definitions which are introduced in IFC 4 that I'll talk about in a second. And what this model view definition is really selecting is what is the information essential for that exchange. And some of these are official model view definitions which are maintained and developed by buildingSMART, and I think we'll see model view definitions published by various big clients and things like that for the exchanges that they'd like to use IFC for in the near future. I'd also then quickly like to talk about the versions of IFC that exist as well. So if you've seen the timeline of IFC, it started 20 years ago, as I said. IFC 2x3 was published about 12 years ago, if I recall correctly, and IFC 4 was published about 6 years ago. And so if you're creating IFC, I guess there's an inclination and a desire to choose the latest and greatest. And so if your software supports IFC 4, and you're not aware of this, you probably choose to use IFC 4 as the version of IFC to particularly export. For several reasons, and I won't go into a lot of the detail of this unless there's questions raised on this, the most reliable use or version of IFC to use at this particular point in time is still IFC 2x3. And the main reason for that is that the software that you're commonly using is certified probably only against the version of IFC 2x3. So buildingSMART do test and audit and try and verify implementations of IFC to say that they're compliant and producing valid files. And there's only now, 6 years into IFC 4, some certifications which are emerging for a reference view. A reference view is more a visualization view of IFC. So you'd expect to see primitive shape representations like the one on the left, which are mesh faceted descriptions for the geometry. IFC 4 includes a lot of improvements, particularly NURBS and other history-based shape representations for sweeps, etc. So you will get higher quality models with IFC 4. It's just the reliability might be less. So you probably expect to maybe need to do some more rigorous validation or verification because the reliability of the implementations is not quite there, particularly for the design transfer view, which is more with the intent of taking an intelligent model in software A and then using it as an intelligent model in software B. So you'll see today I'm going to talk a lot about how do you actually select the IFC 2x3 coordination model view for the highest reliability. The last concept that I want to touch on before I get into the actual authoring applications is just around information requirements and property templates. So buildingSMART have actually identified in the order of at least a few hundred property sets and about over 1,000 individual properties which relate to metadata that exists on the concepts and objects that exist within this when you create an IFC file. If you've ever opened an IFC file up in a viewer like Solibri, you can select an object like a table and then you'll get like a tab of the different properties and attributes which have been recorded on that particular object or its relating type. So, I mean, normally again, when someone asks for an IFC file, they should be clear about three things basically that I've just touched on. First of all, the version. Do they want IFC 2x3 or IFC 4? The second thing should be the model view definition or the subset of IFC that they want this particular file to be compliant with. So that's probably going to be coordination view, or it could be something either like a design transfer of bespoke design model view definition. And the third thing should probably be them telling you what are the attributes and properties that they want on the objects when you give them the IFC file. So as I said, buildingSMART have maintained a global set of agreed common attributes and properties that they'd expect to be within that model. But again, a client or another project participant might define their own information requirements and give you a template describing what are the properties that they expect to see on those objects when you give them the IFC files. Okay, so this webinar, the Beginner's Guide to Authoring IFC, I've touched on some of the fundamentals around IFC. But what I'm going to start looking at now quickly is just some beginner's guide to authoring IFC and consuming IFC in popular applications. I can't go too much detail in the time remaining, so if you're interested in more advanced aspects, as I mentioned earlier, either write questions here in the chat box or get in contact with us about what you'd like to see in future webinars. And I'd like to also stress the point that IFC can be complex, it's a comprehensive data model, and it's quite difficult and tedious for human beings to validate and check it. And so first and foremost, if you're having issues with IFC, either the ease of creating it or the complexity about how to create it, first and foremost consult with your application technical support, including the various forums. So you pay a lot of money to use these authoring applications, and you could very well expect some support in terms of actually how you use IFC as a tool that's provided within that application. As I mentioned, there are many applications and tools that support the exchange of IFC data. There's no way we can go through them all, so we've hand-selected 4 different applications that are popular authoring applications in Australia, just as a getting started guide. And again, if we're missing applications that you'd like some help or webinars on, then again, get in touch and let us know. So the first application that I'm going to have a quick look at is the beginner's guide, or the Revit application, which is certainly very popular and very commonly used in Australia. And there's a few resources that I'm listing here as options for further advice or data source for actually how to use and generate IFC in Revit. So there's a handbook which was published last year, which is an excellent resource. It goes into a lot more detail on some of the topics that I'm going to touch on during this webinar, so you can download that for free from this address here. I think one of the most interesting things that's happened with the Revit IFC implementation is that they've actually isolated it and separated it from the base product development. So you do get IFC out of the box when you install a new version of Revit, but you can actually now, it's published as a plugin on the Autodesk App Store as an independent product. And so first and foremost, if you're authoring IFC, I'd suggest regularly checking the App Store to see, is there a new version of that plugin that exists, so you get the latest fixes and the latest improvements in what you're authoring. It's not just a separate product, it's actually quite interestingly been open sourced, so you can actually see at least most of the source code that creates the IFC and links the IFC in Revit. So if you're a software developer, you can actually compile it and test it and debug it. I think the other big attraction about actually isolating it is that the App Store, there's certainly the possibility of actually building the plugin now for earlier versions of Revit. So Revit 2020 was released recently, but not everyone is going to be using Revit 2020 for at least some time. And so if you're using Revit 2017 or Revit 2018, then you can actually build the plugin for that version or ask Autodesk to provide the plugin for that version. So if you want the latest and greatest fixes for Revit, an older version of Revit, then you can certainly ask for it. I'd certainly say it's not commonly published yet, but certainly request that of Autodesk. And again, they're a business, so the more requests and demands they get for supporting the older versions of Revit, the higher the priority it will be for them to actually build that and give you a new version for that particular version of the application. So I've opened up the Revit application here, and I'm going to, as I said, touch quickly on some of the configuration around how you produce an IFC and how you can consume an IFC. So with Revit, and let's start with authoring IFC, you'll find that you access this or execute the creation of an IFC file through this Export IFC button here. There's two ways of actually setting some of the configuration and options for creating the IFC. One that's probably a little bit hidden is if you scroll down the menu further to the options, and then under IFC options, you'll at least get a table of values about how to map from a Revit category or a Revit subcategory into an IFC class or concept. So you'll see if we scroll down that effectively you can, for example, sometimes you use a wall tool to model a curb or something like that. Now, if it appears for someone else as a wall object, then that's not necessarily great. So you can actually configure a subcategory to a different IFC classification, etc. So again, you can load and save these, but that configuration is external to where most of the majority of the export options are configured. So if I want now just say I want to export an IFC from Revit, then by default up comes this particular dialog, which allows you to nominate where you want the IFC to be created. And then you'll see out of the box you get a number of preset or pre-configured options about what the version of IFC is that you want to create. So I touched on before that IFC 4 is a newer version of IFC, and you can see that presented here in these two options with the model view definition of reference view and design transfer view listed. You'll see here probably by default IFC 2x3 coordination view 2.0, which is the version I'd certainly recommend with the highest reliability. And then you'll see some of the other model view definitions like a facility management handover view, a model view definition for the Singapore building control check, and some slightly other different versions for Kobe, etc., out of the box pre-configured. If you click on the modify setup, then by default, then if you're actually on a pre-configured model view definition, you actually can't change and edit these values out of the box. If you do want to create your own custom export, then you can duplicate a model view, one of these options, and then you can start changing the settings, etc., as part of that. So here you'll see under the file type, you can nominate, is it an IFC XML, is it a zipped IFC or a zipped IFC XML, which I mentioned before. I can't go through all the options, but you'll see there's options here for phases, etc. Whether you only want to export elements visible in the view. And one thing on that, I think you do need to be in a model view, not a schedule or something like that, or you'll have trouble trying to execute the exporter. Property sets. Now, property sets can actually have a significant impact on the file size. So I touched on before that buildingSMART publish common property sets or agreed property sets. And at the moment, if you tick this option there, configured in the coding of the plugin to actually try and map a property name on an object to the property name in a common property set as part of this. There's probably a temptation to export all Revit properties, but that will have a severe impact on the resultant IFC file. So I'd recommend not doing that. And the other thing that you can basically do is customize or control and map Revit parameters into the IFC property using a text file. So if we have a quick look at the contents of this text file, you'll see here that it lists the property sets or groupings of properties, the property names, the nature of the property, as well as then an optional Revit parameter name to draw the value from. And you can actually map multiple parameters into one property as part of this. And it's a way then, what we also don't want to do is then say load other properties into Revit and have a duplicate fire rating or something like that. You can control and configure that export so that the mapping from a built-in parameter appears in an IFC property as part of this process. Other quick options that exist on this are the level of detail for geometry. So you can control whether you want severe faceting or small faceting or refined accurate geometry by changing this configuration. And then I would really recommend not touching the advanced settings. These really should only be used with extreme care and perhaps more knowledge about what they're doing. So if you're getting started with IFC, leave the advanced settings as configured out of the box. So that's basically authoring IFC out of Revit. When you're wanting to consume or if you're being provided with IFC and you need to use that or reference that in Revit, then you have two options out of the box. The first is to open the IFC. So if you click on Open IFC, then it actually allows you to select that IFC file, and you get very few options about how to configure and control this. There's one option here for whether you want to join particularly structural elements and two correct lines that are slightly off axes. And this, what the Open IFC does is it will start a project template and then start to try and convert the IFC definitions as much as possible into intelligent native Revit definitions. So, for example, if you've got a beam in an IFC file, it will try and create a structural framing object that's family-based that you could then edit and manipulate downstream. Two things, I guess, quickly on, or one thing on when actually consuming IFC with Revit. It doesn't like it doesn't import the model relative to shared coordinates. So if you're using an authoring application like 12D, you probably need to set a 0 base point or manually change the base point in the IFC file so that the extents of the model don't come too far out of origin, or you will get some you might get strange displays of elements or missing elements that appear as part of that process. The second way of then consuming IFC is not to try and do any conversion, but just do a visualization or a reference of the IFC data model in the Revit environment. And that option is found here under the Insert menu under Link IFC. And what that won't do is try and create native Revit objects. It will just use the geometry description as best as possible in the IFC definition, and create the geometry in a direct shape or a geometry representation within that Revit environment. So it's faster because it's not trying to do that conversion, and it should be more accurate and more reliable as part of that. So as soon as you get an interpretation, there's some sort of approximation or as part of that process. So the higher reliability of getting accurate geometry to reference is certainly using the Link IFC approach. I think they're the main points that I wanted to touch on with Revit. So we'll have a quick look then on the next application that we want to touch on. and that is 12D. So I unfortunately don't have access to the. So 12D is a civil infrastructure authoring application, which is again used quite popularly and quite commonly here in Australia. Unfortunately, I don't have access to 12D software, so you can see here some web links. There's a webinar that was presented by Lee Gregory, which is available through this link here, which is quite comprehensive and quite a good introduction into particularly authoring IFC from within 12D. And again, you'll find some more information on this. And again, if we can follow up with our own webinar or workshops, etc., around 12D, perhaps, if there's a strong interest in using IFC there. Lee certainly has been very active in buildingSMART International as well, with the changes and improvements for the infrastructure concepts within the IFC 4 point releases and IFC 5. So again, you should see a lot of improvements as the concepts required for IFC become published in the near future. The next application that I'm going to quickly turn to is IFC Open Buildings, or IFC Open Buildings is more commonly thought of perhaps still as EcoSim from Bentley. And I'm going to switch to that application and then, and quickly again touch on importing and exporting IFC options from EcoSim as part of this. So we'll start with exporting again, and you'll find the import and export buttons, menu options here on the primary menu. If you look under Exchange file types, you'll find here the industry foundation classes offering here on the dialog. So if we have a quick look through again, you should notice a lot of overlap and similarity with what we saw in Revit. You'll see here the model view definitions and the versions of IFC. I didn't say on that civil superstructure image that I showed in the difference between IFC 4 and IFC 2x3. That was using the NURBS or splines technology preview with IFC 4 from EcoSim. So that will allow those smarter shape representations, but it is a technology preview, so should be used with care. You'll find options here for zipping an IFC file, for controlling the faceting and the resulting file size, and then other options here for mapping, again, properties and classification, in a similar way that we saw with the Revit environment. With importing IFC models into EcoSim, you'll find under Import IFC, I've not found any configuration options and things like that really with this. Although there's the options button there, which is grayed out. So again, I think it just works out of the box or doesn't work out of the box. And again, if we thought that having some configuration options would be useful there, feeding that back to Bentley would be an excellent thing. The other applications quickly to touch on are ArchiCAD from Graphisoft, and Graphisoft certainly has some excellent features and is quite well advanced with using and producing IFC files. You'll actually access a lot of their options under the Save As or Export in the Interoperability Tools menu, and you can then change the file type to actually nominate an IFC file just on the Save As menu here. ArchiCAD actually shipped with a whole bunch of translators out of the box they've done a lot of work about what works best in subtle variations for different receiving applications. You'll see out of the box model view definitions, as well as if you're trying to target an import or link in Revit structure or Ski Engineer or different applications. So again, you can actually modify them if you want to change and create your own configuration of that. You can click on interoperability under the IFC translators, and then you can start to set some of these other things about property mapping, geometry conversions, and some of these other configurations through these settings here within ArchiCAD. And similar actually for importing is that you can click on Open and then change the menu options again to IFC or IFC XML or IFC zip, and then pick the IFC file, and then it will start a new project template and bring that model data into the ArchiCAD environment. The last one that I'm quickly going to touch on is authoring IFC from Tekla. So Tekla is a structural detailing application used for concrete and steel structures quite a lot. It's particularly good at fabrication and CNC instructions and shop drawing production. Again, there's a link there if you're actually looking for some guidance and support from Tekla Structures website. And it, again, has sort of 3 mechanisms for working with IFC as part of that workflow. So, again, the way that you actually author IFC is you click on the File, Export, and then choose the IFC option. And then you will see that it will come up with a number of options to configure this. One thing you won't find at the moment here is how to configure or export between IFC 2x3 and IFC 4. Out of the box, Tekla only provides, only enables IFC 2x3. And if you actually want to not use IFC 4, there's an advanced setting that you need, an advanced option that you need to set in accordance with this website to make the IFC 4 menu option available. Again, you'll see here some model view definitions. They have their own advanced steel fabrication view, which creates the most intelligent and compact model. They're suggesting here that it probably is only applicable for use with Tekla BIM site, but if you're using software capable of more advanced IFC use cases, I definitely recommend using that. Again, you can start to nominate additional property sets, whether you want to export selected objects or all objects, and then a base point reference or a remote model, ignoring if you want to nominate a base point location as part of that export. And there's some other configuration options here about the nature of the elements to produce, whether you want groups or assemblies created, and some of these sorts of characteristics. In terms of consuming IFC with Tekla, then you'll actually find that here under the model reference dialog. You can reference a model, you can add a model, and then choose an IFC file as one of the file formats supported in the add a reference model. There's some basic configuration if you want to translate or move the model as part of that process. And then once having done that, there is a configuration option about trying to convert structure models into native Tekla objects. So that's a separate routine that can be run instead of just a reference for coordination checks. You can run that routine to try and generate native Tekla columns and beams as part of that process. Okay, so unfortunately, this in the time frame that we've got, I can't go into lots of detail. We will now take some questions. I guess I just rehash the point that if IFC authoring and consumption is tedious or difficult, then please demand improvements from your software developers. You can certainly try and use buildingSMART as a mechanism for trying to enable that as well, and get in touch with people like myself if you do have questions or want some advice as part of that. Just to quickly promote some other buildingSMART events that are coming up. As I said, we did the Digital Infrastructure Network Drinks and Strategic Seminar in Perth last week, which was a great success. Adelaide is coming up in July, so you can register interest for that event there. We are planning in the minute product seminars to run in combination with GS1 later in the year, and some technical seminars to run after that. So, and as I said, I'll have a quick look at the comments, or Aaron might share with me in a second some questions if he's picked some out, but certainly keep an eye out for future webinars, which could include topics like how do we check and validate IFC after we've created it or after we've been given it, because I think that's a very important topic, and then also how you can manage information requirements or properties or other topics that are of interest. And you can find details about that on the community calendar that buildingSMART have created. Okay, Aaron, have we got any questions?
Is IFC able to cross-reference to 2D drawings like DWFX does? That's from Rocky.
It's interesting because the emphasis on IFC has been on creating 3D geometry and model elements. So there actually is still some capability of 2D annotation and line work and things like that within the IFC schema, although it seems to be largely being phased out. The idea then being, I guess, if you create the 3D objects in an authoring application like Revit or ArchiCAD, is you can use its drawing production tools to produce drawings as part of that process. So I would say basically no, not yet. Again, I mean, buildingSMART can listen to demands and requests and suggestions about how you'd like to see IFC produced, but a typical workflow at the moment would still probably produce DWG or PDF, 2D drawing viewports, and then the 3D model for use in IFC with the extra attributes and relationships for more sophisticated workflows. Again, while I'm looking for more questions, I apologise if people did have difficulties in hearing, but this webinar was recorded, so we will post this on YouTube as soon as possible so that you can watch this back. Okay, so how do you bring an IFC from programs like 12D into Revit? How can you modify the base point of the IFC? That's an excellent question. I've seen Sean Lawrence from GHD do a presentation on this in Built in recent last year. I think he spoke about it at the 12D conference, this year. As it's a text file, if you're brave enough, you can actually open. I'm trying to see if I can find one quickly here, but you can actually open that IFC text file and edit the contents of it. That's not really a recommended workflow. It's one, it's easy to get an invalid IFC and change the wrong thing or not quite get the desired result. I think the most important thing is to add pressure or suggestions and requests to Autodesk that they actually should, the same as when you link in a DWG or a different file format, to provide the option of a base point. I know that has been asked of them. You do have one alternative option, which is Geometry Gym provides an alternative IFC importer, which can work in relation to shared coordinates. So you can establish a shared coordinate in your project file and import that way. So the only other way, as I said, is to establish a local base point in the 12D model and try and export relative to that. And then that model geometry, if the base point is in a common position, should come in local to the Revit origin as part of that workflow. Nick's asked a question here: does IFC support civil design elements such as road alignments and profiles? Those sorts of concepts are being added, and there are already some versions of IFC 4 which have been published, IFC 4 X1 or IFC 4 X2. You'll see here, even in this example file that I've picked out in the PowerPoint, you'll see concepts for alignments and positioning systems which have been introduced to that. Again, the sooner we get testing and certification happening on this, the better. The different applications will recognize these concepts. So I would still probably describe the implementations as work in progress, and there's still some concepts such as Cant that are being still worked on, and I'm not sure if the vertical alignment has been as rigorously has been tested in depth as much as the horizontal alignment. But again, there'll be more emerging in the latter part of this year and next year as the draft and the release candidates of the standard emerge. So you should be able to test and prototype this in the near future. I think what's been interesting with the work with Transport for New South Wales is if it's not parametric alignments and things like that, you can use a classification system such as Uniclass, but not just Uniclass, and still identify concepts in IFC 2x3 in an infrastructure sense without waiting on these newer versions. But that's probably for another discussion. Does any of the authoring software make use of IFC 4.1 with the alignment and TIN? Certainly, again, I should check. 12D does, as I recall it. So a triangulated network is added to IFC 4x.1. So certainly 12D does it. Again, I know I've done some prototyping of that with Civil 3D. But again, hopefully some of that stuff is coming out of the box. So again, we can chase that up and find more details. Again, ask your software vendors when it's coming or how you can access it if they've done it. Again, I think validating this is an important part about getting this. And I think the other thing that can be frustrating when using IFC is if you don't get many warning messages about when things aren't recognized or aren't used, even when they are in the IFC. The topology is not consistent. I have to research that. I'm assuming that one's Revit. Again, maybe we'll chase up on this. Aaron, are we just about out of time, or?
Up to you. We can go a little bit longer and answer a few more questions if you like.
Okay, so again, I'm not sure. I haven't seen that topology is not consistent warning message, but again, if if you want to, Zoran, if you want to get in touch and tell me which application, I can try and see if I can research it quickly. The BBC, show the BBC YouTube link again. Well, it's actually this slide here. So if you've got a QR code ready, you should be able to capture it here. Or if you Google for the end of Babel on YouTube, you'll certainly find. I think the sad thing is, as it said, this script could probably be reused to record today. But I guess it's this, again, we have made progress and we need to continue making progress. And I think the great thing about the governments, as very important clients talking about openBIM, is only going to help accelerate improvements and advances in the IFC standard. Editing IFC files directly, there are very few software that actually natively read and write an IFC file format without a conversion from their own system. There is an application called Constructivity that I know of from Tim Chipman, who's been heavily involved in buildingSMART. And I think you'll find some other tools like SimpleBIM, which actually can allow you to actually sort of post-process and edit and configure an IFC file even after it's happened. Again, there's been some workflows and prototypes which I've started to present at Built with Transport for New South Wales, particularly about managing metadata in Excel or a database or some other environment, and then how you can push and pull that in through an existing IFC file from a model that doesn't have all that information. So, so Thomas, again, if you get in contact, I can share some details of that presentation and others. Nando's asked here, is there any initiatives to promote the use of IFC from city councils and other official entities or training them on it? That's an excellent question. I believe Jon Mirtschin, I guess it's because there's so many city councils that operate independently, it's harder to get with buildingSMART to approach all of them. I certainly know there's some sort of trailblazers and efforts that are probably becoming apparent, particularly in the capital city local councils. Again, there's some effort to be done on that, and I guess some of the mandates and things that are happening in Queensland might encourage that. And there was some discussions around Victoria as well that I've seen about wider adoption of BIM above and beyond at the state level. That's probably, well, 45 minutes. So I don't know if I missed any questions. I apologize if I did. Again, if anyone has suggestions for future webinars or topics to go into more detail, then we look forward to hearing them. Otherwise, certainly we do look forward to seeing you at some of our face-to-face events at the various cities throughout Australia and New Zealand through the rest of the year. Aaron, do you want to say anything to close? Or
No, all good from my end. Thanks for joining, guys, and keep an ear out for our next webinar.